The topic of safe and just policing is a very timely one. At the request of the ACLU and 34 other community groups, the Department of Justice undertook to investigate whether the Seattle Police Department was engaged in a pattern and practice of use of force, excessive use of force. As you undoubtedly know, in December of last year, the Department of Justice issued a report that found indeed that the Seattle Police Department had been engaged in a pattern and practice of excessive use of force. And the DOJ offered a set of recommendations for how the police department should solve that problem. And now is recommending that the department move toward a court-monitored correction to implement reforms. Now I want to tell you a little bit about our featured speaker. Norm Stamper is in a unique position to provide an understanding of current police practices, what works, what doesn't, and what underlies the use of force. He was a police officer for 34 years. We know him best as the man who served as our own police chief from 1994 to the year 2000, which included the turbulent events of WTO in 1999. But before that, he worked in San Diego as the executive director of Pete Wilson's Crime Control Commission. Norm received numerous awards and citations during his career in San Diego, including the Diogenes Award of Public Relations Society of America for his leadership in the wake of the Rodney King incident and the subsequent Simi Valley trials. Then, as Seattle's police chief, Norm led a process of major organizational restructuring, creating new bureaus of professional responsibility, community policing, and family and youth protection. He's been involved with the National Advisory Council on the Violence Against Women Act, the Police Executive Research Forum, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and the Major Cities Chiefs. An outspoken advocate of drug law reform, he serves on the advisory boards of NORML and the Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, otherwise known as LEAP. Over the past 3 decades, he has conducted organizational effectiveness and leadership training and consulting for both public and private organizations throughout North America. His articles have appeared in the Huffington Post and The Nation, among others. And as a side note, I've learned that he doesn't just love writing about the truth or speaking about it, but he is also going to be coming out with a novel, which we eagerly await reading. It is a great pleasure, and we are very thankful to Norm Stamper for joining us tonight.
It is November 30th, 1999. It's cold, it's wet, it's windy. It's not an atypical late fall Seattle day. Hundreds of people have gathered at the intersection of 6th and University, along with tens of thousands of other anti-globalization demonstrators have decided to make a statement about globalization. We had every intention of helping them make that statement. We had planned staged photo ops, civil disobedience arrests. We had thought through what we would do if we had problems with much larger crowds than were expected. We thought we were ready. We thought we were prepared. We thought our 11 months of planning were up to the task, and they simply were not. I had my, I would call it epiphany, but it was that revelatory moment when I saw a very thin line of King County Sheriff's deputies guarding the entrance and exit to the Sheraton's parking garage. I looked from them and the hundreds of people who were pushing against them and trying to penetrate that barrier to get into the Sheraton. A tactic that clearly, had it been successful, would have made effectively prisoners of WTO delegates. Our responsibility extended to those delegates and to the media, to those who favored, those who were opposed to free trade, fair trade, and every other issue that brought tens of thousands of people to our city. And they had done an exemplary job. I then looked over to the intersection of 6th and University and saw that it was completely occupied by demonstrators who, in the face of repeated warnings to vacate the intersection, elected to sit down and lock arms. We had to have that intersection. I said this in this room in 2005, 5 years after my retirement. I said it on Saturday of that week when I tendered my badge and my resignation. We had to have that intersection. It was the cop in me who made that decision. A decision, incidentally, to support my field commander, my operations commander, and why wouldn't I? I agreed with them completely. I offered an explanation on that night in 2005, and after my talk and reading of my book, a gentleman came up and said, I used to respect you. I've always kind of liked you, and I used to respect you, and I no longer have that respect for you. And part of it is simply because even now you are saying you had to have that intersection. We had to have that hill. We had this sort of militaristic response that we believed was absolutely necessary given the fact that we couldn't get an aid car through should somebody be in cardiac arrest or the victim of a stabbing or some such other thing. We couldn't get a fire truck through. We couldn't get a police car through that strategic intersection. And we knew that 4 or 5 other contingents of demonstrators in what's called the feeder march, which is a very common black bloc tactic, were converging on the very same area, and that, in effect, moments later, the biggest segment of the population, the downtown transient population that were anti-globalization demonstrators, would be kicking off the labor march from Seattle Center to downtown. So we really, really had to have that intersection. Today, and as a result of what that man said to me and what many, many others said to me and what I thought about long and hard, I realize that it was the cop in me who made that decision. The chief in me should have vetoed it. The chief in me should have recognized I'm a product of the 60s. I'm a product of the police response to civil rights demonstrations, to campus unrest, to anti-war demonstrations. A whole lot of gas was filling the streets of San Diego and cities across the country, this city included. I should have known better. But at the time I didn't, and I clung to my belief that it was the only thing we could do. We didn't have the people to meet our promise to provide that civil disobedience moment for demonstration leaders, principally Direct Action Network, but others with whom we had met well in advance of WTO week. We didn't have the people. When you don't have the people and you really do believe you need to accomplish a particular mission, it's likely to have to be done with chemical agents. So we elected to use, first as a threat and then as a reality, tear gas to clear the intersection. It worked. Tear gas works. Believe me, it works. Many of you in this room, I suspect, have had a face full, have experienced what it is like to inhale CS gas, or for that matter, pepper spray. We had to have that intersection. Well, did we really? No, we did not need to have that intersection. In about 2006, 2007, having really made a fundamental change, a revision, if you will, of my own personal history, and come to the realization that we could have let those people just sit there. It was cold, it was wet, it was windy. Eventually, they would get up and leave of their own accord and go to another strategic intersection. There are very good and sound reasons for wanting an intersection cleared. There are even more than I've listed here, but That's not the issue. The issue was I made the biggest mistake of my 34-year career that morning, and I will regret it to the grave. And I said this in 2006, 2007 at an ACLU forum at the University of Washington, not knowing that the man who had come up to me in this hall was present that afternoon. When he approached me, he had tears rolling down his cheeks because I had said that I had made a grievous personal and professional mistake. It was a wonderful moment for me to, because every American loves a redemption story. But it was also a fresh and painful reminder of the fact that I didn't do the right thing at the right time, which led to so much grief for the people of this city, for the demonstrators, for the WTO ministers, and for my cops. I happen to be an anti-globalization advocate personally, but I also recognize my responsibilities, and I failed. I mean, I really did. So I do certainly wish that I had made the right decision that day. But I tell this story because I think it's instructive of what the theme is all about tonight. And that's essentially the intersection of the drug war and police militarization. I brought along a sophisticated visual aid that I have not used in many, many years. It's a high-tech visual aid, and I'm going to introduce it as I share with you my vision for policing and contrast that vision for policing against what I consider to be the current reality. So I'm going to create physically tension, in effect, between what I want, what I advocate, and what I believe is the current reality. So let me begin. I'm going to use a hypothetical police department, not one that's under investigation by the Department of Justice, not San Diego, not Seattle. And by the way, thank you so much for the introduction, Jesse. I'll just clarify one thing, and that was while I was Pete Wilson's lackey for 2 or 3 years on the Crime Control Commission, a wonderful experience, by the way, I was also a member of the sworn ranks of that department for 28 years. So I spent the first 28 years of my police career as a police officer, supervisor, manager, and executive. And when Norm Rice picked me as his chief, I was the number 2 guy in the department responsible for all day-to-day operations. I do that by way of credentialing myself and hoping to add some credibility to what I'm about to say. So we're going to talk about the Metropolitan Police Department. If you watch any cop shows on TV, you'll see badges and patches and sides of cars labeled Metro, the Metropolitan Police Department. Unfortunately, there is a Metropolitan Police Department. It's got a somewhat longer name, and it's in our nation's capital. But we'll just call this police department the Metropolitan Police Department. I see, and that's what a vision is about, I see the Metropolitan Police Department as the most effective in the country. Effective at what? Stopping people from hurting other people. A police department whose people are totally dedicated to effective crime fighting, preventing crime wherever possible, detecting, apprehending, and assisting in the successful prosecution of people who hurt other people through predatory offenses. I see members of the Metropolitan Police Department as the most dignified and respectful service providers you'll find anywhere. They treat one another with dignity and respect. They treat their community partners with dignity and respect, and partners they are. They are fully and authentically engaged in everything from policy making to program development, these community partners. Friends of the police department, blind and loyal supporters of the police department, but critics of police practices, particularly those critics who have borne the brunt of either neglect or oppressive police practices, in some cases for decades. I see a partnership in which the community is engaged in policymaking, program development, crisis management. I see community partners involved meaningfully and with muscle and teeth in reviewing police practices and helping to hold their police department and officers accountable for reasoned, responsive, and responsible police practices. I see an organizational environment, an atmosphere that has been rendered safe for everyone, for people of color, for gays and lesbians, for people who hold opposing points of view. I see an environment in which all employees at all levels can express their honest opinions about police policies and practices within the Metropolitan Police Department. These are employees who can disagree with their chief if they would like. They can do so publicly if they would like. They cannot speak for the chief. They cannot spin policy to their liking, but they can, in fact, say, I disagree with Chief Stamper when he marched in uniform in the Gay Pride Parade, and who marched every single year of his career in this city in the Gay Pride Parade. They can express whatever feelings and opinions they want, but they have to follow the law, and they have to follow policy. If those policies are smart, it makes them so much easier to follow. If the officers themselves, frontline professionals, participate in the formulation of those policies, if they jointly work with the community to forge those policies. We have a police force whose members and community partners can work collaboratively in preparation for a major event in the city, can work collaboratively to launch new programs and to hold the police department accountable. So I see a police department as very, very effective at what it does and what it's here to do. I see a police department that recognizes that treating people courteously has an enormous payoff. I see a police department whose officers in this Metropolitan PD never use excessive force. Never, ever use racial or ethnic slurs. Who recognize that if in fact they engage in racist or sexist or homophobic behavior or indulge any other brand of bigotry that they may harbor, that they will in fact be made to understand that Safeway's hiring, that they will in fact not be allowed to be a member of this Metropolitan Police Department. So I see a police department that's really good at what it does. Police officers who have the deepest respect for the Constitution of this country. That's our secular Bible. I used that term a week ago and thought I was so cool. I used it with a reporter and I said, I hope you're going to quote that one, It is as close to sacred as anything that I can imagine that binds all of us together. They have respect for the Bill of Rights. They have respect particularly for the First and Fourth Amendments, which they are intimately involved with on a regular basis. That's my vision of the Metropolitan Police Department. It's the finest police department in the country. The current reality for me is that not every police supervisor or manager, for example, cares about the health and well-being and the safety of his or her police officers and doesn't have the wisdom to fake it and the skill to fake it. Look, leadership in many respects is a performance art, right? I spent 34 years in police work, and there were many of those days when I didn't feel like coming to work. When I felt, I'm not talking about having a cold or the flu. It's when something had happened either in my own practice, particularly early in my career, first year of my career, where I systematically abused the people I was hired to serve, or later in my career when officers celebrated an example or an instance of excessive force. So that informs my current reality. Not everybody has bought into my vision. Not everybody has come to understand how nice it would be for me if they lived life according to my standards. Part of the current reality is not every police officer is fully engaged in his or her legitimate crime-fighting responsibilities. Responds with a slower, more apathetic response to black-on-black crime, to gay-on-gay crime, to crimes that they have decided aren't really important. I'm not talking now about victimless crimes. It's a requirement to say so-called victimless crimes, but I choose to reject that requirement, and particularly when it comes to drugs and the sex industry. But I do see very, very often police officers who are shirking their responsibilities. It's not the majority of cops, but it's a sizable enough minority that it makes for the reputation of the organization. I hear often, well, only 10% of the Metropolitan Police Department is like that. Heavy-handed or apathetic or unresponsive or irresponsible. Only 10%, maybe it's even 5%. Well, math has never been my strong point, but if you have 5 or 10 cops out of 100 who are making 10 to 15 contacts a day or a night, they are influencing the reputation of that organization in a very, very significant way. We simply cannot afford it, but yet the current reality accommodates it. And let me say something about accommodation. The blue wall of silence is alive and well. Police officers witness things that behavior, language, and fellow officers that they ought to be reporting, and indeed that they ought to be stopping in the moment. A Rodney King incident, for example, where police officers know that excessive force is being used, where they should know that a crime is being committed, and yet they act like lay people, like bystanders, like witnesses to an act, rather than cops, rather than police officers who really, in that instance, for example, needed to wade in and stop it. Might even have saved the jobs of these fellow officers instead of protecting them. I see, as part of the current reality, a good deal of racism, sexism, and homophobia. Some misogyny. I see other brands of bigotry that are tolerated, if not celebrated, by some other cops. I had to get to town a day early when I came to Seattle because I knew that Rampart was playing at the Varsity. So I had to go see Woody Harrelson playing a dirty cop, and he plays it quite well. As movies go, I'm a film freak, I'd give it 3 stars out of 5. It's entertaining, it's diverting, it's also ugly to watch, and you don't have to be a cop or an ex-cop to watch it and have very visceral reactions to what this man does. So he does some very bad things. I won't give it away, but I will tell you that he is celebrated for having done those very bad things by some of his fellow officers. So the current reality is very much out of sync, in my judgment, with my vision for policing. The current reality is also that I'm getting really, really tired up here. My arms are beginning to shake. My knuckles are turning a really interesting green-white shade. I cannot tolerate much longer the tension between what I want and what I have. I have got to relieve this tension. Very often what happens when we experience a gap between what we want and what we have, and that pretty much defines life, we reverse I should say, release the tension in this direction, don't we? Well, why does the Metropolitan Police Department have to be the best in the country? Why can't we just say the Metropolitan Police Department's the best police department west of the Mississippi? Oh, there's some release of tension. My arms, however, are still shaking. It won't be very long before I will not be able to string together a simple declarative sentence and finish this presentation. I am being affected by this tension right now. This is not a joke or a game, it's an illustration. Fortunately, it doesn't have huge consequences to anybody other, I guess, my nervous system or some such thing. That, by the way, was involuntary. I'm not doing that for dramatic effect. I want it to stop, but it's real. So why don't I just, given the fact that that didn't satisfactorily release all the tension, why don't I just say the Metropolitan Police Department is one of the best police departments in the Pacific Northwest. Some more release of tension, yet not enough. Why don't we just say the Metropolitan Police Department is one of King County's better law enforcement agencies? Okay, I'll release some more tension. Or I can release all the tension, and please allow yourself to think about cops who join the police department caring, wanting to do right and wanting to do good, and being exposed to some of the practices of the current reality. Why don't I just release all tension and say it just doesn't matter? I mean, it really doesn't. It's a job. You can call it a calling if you want, Stamper. You can call it noble and honorable work. We're society's garbage collectors. We're not social workers. We're not this. We're not that. Let's just release all of that tension and give up any illusion or pretense to excellence. And what I picture, I think, Tom Peters, the kind of gas bag of a management guru, who, when he was given a talk one day, was met with resistance, and he was given a talk on excellence. He wrote the books In Search of Excellence, Passion for Excellence. I'm really dating myself because these are very, very old books now. But I will give him a nod and say that a police officer who decides that the tension is just not worth it, the problems at home, the problems with alcohol and other substance abuse, the problems with one's children, the problems with one's neighbors, that being a cop means just checking out and letting go of all of that tension. And so what I picture on the side of Metropolitan Police Department patrol cars is a little banner above the logo, the symbol of the city of Metropolitan. A banner that says, the Metropolitan Police Department, we're no worse than anybody else. Okay? Okay. Problem is solved. You don't have anything to live up to. I offer this illustration in the context of tonight's theme because I really believe it's important that we all understand that there are people who are dreamers, who are visionaries, who really care about the reputation of their organization. They're standing in the community, who joined the police department to do a good job for their communities, but who in fact in many cases have been affected by the current reality. One current reality for me, and I've never been shy about expressing it, is as strong a labor guy as I am, my kin come from Harlan County, Kentucky, by way of Muncie, Indiana. And I made a threat today in an earlier talk that I am going this spring to Harlan County to soak it in. I will get teary-eyed. I will get chills up and down my spine every time I hear Joe Hill, and it don't matter who sings it. It's just, it really affects me. But there is an exception to my love for unions, and they are police unions. And it's so easy to say, well, it's this individual or that individual, this president or that president. It is, in fact, structurally, the tension between, if you will, management and labor, between what we conceive of as management prerogatives to help create the kind of police department we want is oftentimes, virtually always met with resistance. I could not convince a former president of the Seattle Police Officers Guild to accept the invitation of even one of my 11 community advisory councils. I met regularly with the African American community, the East African American community, sexual minorities community, a term that they developed to incorporate gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, questioning, queer community. Wouldn't fit on the card. So the idea really was to create communities of interest that I would sit down with on a regular basis and hear from. I heard from a youth advisory council. I met one of them today who's no longer a youth. You know, I'm feeling my age with each passing day. But this guy was very appreciative of the opportunity as a 17-year-old to sit down with the police chief and say, this is the way we think your officers are treating us, and we're happy about this and not so happy about that. My senior staff was always a little wary every time I left the office to go attend a meeting of this, that, or the other community advisory councils, because they knew I would come back with a list. But that was my job, and it was theirs to take that list and address the problems associated with our relationship in the various communities. How does all of this relate to the drug war? Every single police officer who's been hired in the last 40 years has been a frontline soldier on the war on drugs. We have spent $1 trillion prosecuting that war since Richard Nixon famously proclaimed drugs public enemy number one and declared all-out war on them, which, make no mistake, was an all-out war on his own people, and particularly young people and people of color and poor people. Ehrlichman and Haldeman, names from the past, met with the president in the Oval Office, and each of them, after their political careers were cut short, made a statement about a conversation that was conducted in the Oval Office of the presidency. The problem is the Negro problem, says Nixon. But we can't say that. Cities were on fire. We have to come up with another strategy. Haldeman wrote about it in his journals. Ehrlichman testified to it, if you will, in interviews with the media following his fall from grace. They said it. So what are we going to do? Well, drugs. Drugs are a scourge on this country. Nobody likes drugs. Everybody hates drugs, except, of course, the junkies. So let's declare war on drugs. It'll have a unifying effect on the country. And it just might, reverse some trends that he was seeing preparing for his reelection. And by God, they did it. $1 trillion, tens of millions of Americans arrested since the early 1970s for nonviolent drug offenses. Tens of millions. White liberals are fond of gnashing our teeth and wringing our hands and talking about the breakup of the African American nuclear family. Well, guess what? The government has, in large measure, caused a huge percentage of that disintegration of families and communities and neighborhoods. I am an advocate of the legalization of drugs, in large part because I see the violence that has been perpetrated in the execution of the commerce of drugs. It's a $300 to $550 billion a year global industry. There are huge sums of money, obscene amounts of money, untaxed, laundered, to be made in drug trafficking. And the cartels, misnamed cartels in Mexico, have certainly seized on that with a vengeance. It's important, I think, for us to recognize that there are these TCOs, transnational criminal organizations, whose origins are in Mexico, and whose reach has now been felt in 1,000 American cities. Just a few years ago, it was 300. Seattle was one of them, by the way, still are. Atlanta, Houston. The New England states, drug trafficking is dominated by the Sinaloa cartel. In the middle of the country, up through Michigan, that area is controlled by the Zetas and the Gulf cartel. The Tijuana and Juarez cartels as well are operating criminal syndicates in 1,000 American cities. 50,000 people have been killed in a country I love. I grew up in a border town. I loved going to Mexico, even sometimes for the wrong reasons. And even sometimes in the trunk of a car when I was underage. That's part of a theme tonight, confessions, of Norm Stamper. But as I grew older, I really came to love and to appreciate the Mexican people, the Mexican culture. My son is fluent in Spanish, speaks in business Spanish, in political Spanish. He embarrasses me. I love Mexico, and it is heartbreaking to see what these obscene prophets have done in motivating the cartels to protect or expand their markets or their inventory. The vicious crimes that have been committed, the torture that has been committed against rival drug dealers, against the occasional, I hate to put it so cynically, honest cop or politician. It's a tragedy of the first magnitude. It is so dangerous in so many parts of Mexico that literally 50,000 people have been killed since Calderon announced his own drug war about 6 years ago. 50,000 people. Transplant that reality to the United States of America, the drug war would be over. Latin American presidents are meeting this week. I think it starts tomorrow. They're going to meet again in April, and they are talking serious talk about legalization. Serious talk about legalization. They get it, and whatever other political motives people may be properly cynical about, they understand that until the system is changed, it will continue to generate these levels of violence. Now, let me end by suggesting that when you put an American police officer on the front lines of the drug war, empower and require that police officer to enforce drug laws, you're setting up an inevitable conflict between the police and the community, and particularly, once again, communities of color. We can say, till cows lay eggs, well, it's against the law. And people in those communities have a responsibility to obey the law. And certainly I agree that we all have a responsibility to obey the law, except in those instances of civil disobedience, where we pay a price for our disobedience. But we have created, over the last several decades, enormous tension between beat cops as well as narcotics officers, but beat cops particularly in the communities they serve. The city of New York, presided over by one Michael Bloomberg, regularly records 50,000 arrests for possession of marijuana. Not possession for sales, not anything other than have a joint in one's pocket. And let me tell you how they are able to accomplish this, and then I'll conclude my remarks, my talking at you this evening. Let's first take a second to talk about Bloomberg. He is one of many, many celebrated people in our country. 100 million Americans have smoked marijuana at least once. He was one, reports enjoying it, as did Barack Obama, as did Bill Clinton, who famously suggested he didn't inhale. Al Gore, and however slippery he may have been about it, George Bush, and references to youthful indiscretions, but no more explicit than that. We can assume that an awful lot of people, I was about to call them hypocrites, have smoked marijuana, have enjoyed it, or felt that it has relieved stress, like a glass of wine might, like a beer, like a distilled spirit on the rocks. My favorite drug of choice is a bone-dry Kettle One martini, in case anybody's interested. And I know that my drug of choice is more dangerous, by far, than marijuana. It is far less healthy, believe it or not, than heroin. I'm not advocating heroin use. I'm not advocating, for that matter, drug use of any kind. And in fact, I am saying that as we move forward in drug policy reform, we have a special obligation to teach our children why we're saying no to them. Their brains are developing, and whether it's alcohol or tobacco or marijuana or any other drug, our job as grown-ups is to say to them, it's unsafe, it's unhealthy, it's dangerous, and no, you can't. You know, it's one thing to say, just say no. But we can't lie to our kids. We can't tell them, for example, that marijuana is a gateway drug and ask them to believe us when we talk about risks of other drugs like methamphetamines. So it's really, really important, I think, that we recognize the untenable position that we as a society have put our police officers in, enforcing very unpopular laws. The initiative in this state, 502, promises to set up a holy war with the federal government. It is long since time that people in Colorado and Washington and California and Oregon and Michigan and states across this country stand up to my successor, Gil Kerlikowske, and tell him he's wrong. He is absolutely wrong about marijuana having no demonstrable medicinal qualities. I want to introduce that man, for whom I have great respect. I want to introduce that man to marijuana patients I personally know. I want him to hear about their inability as terminal cancer patients to tolerate opioids, who've lost their appetite, who are wasting away. It's a cliche. It's a subject of many, many jokes. But marijuana does, in fact, whet the appetite. And there are an awful lot of people who have had their appetites restored and have been able to keep food down, where in the past on opioids, prescription meds, they have not been able to do so. So it's just wrong for him to say that. It's wrong for him and our president to defend the classification of marijuana as a Schedule I drug. That's idiocy, not to put too fine a point on it. It doesn't belong there, and when finally we muster the courage and the political wisdom to end the drug war, to pass Initiative 502, to convince our federal government through strength of numbers, through organizing, mobilizing, and agitating for meaningful drug policy reform, we will, in fact, see an end to that special tension that gets attached to police officers as they go about their business in a lot of communities across this country. Thanks so much for your time and your attention. Thank you.
Chief Stamper, why don't I get us started while we're waiting for some questions to come up. We have not had as much of an outpouring as we'd like to see from law enforcement supporting I-502. Is it an education problem? Is it a political problem? Is it the cop in somebody? What is it that you think is primarily, everybody's an individual, but what do you think is going on primarily?
Fear. A whole lot of police officers, including sheriffs and police chiefs, have whispered their support to me when I finish a drug policy reform talk. You know, I agree with you completely. You know, drugs are more readily available today at lower prices and higher levels of potency than when Nixon declared the drug war. If you need any more evidence of how colossal and expensive financially and socially and emotionally, you know, that public policy has been. So they get that. Some are true believers, and I would say, I would characterize it this way. The moment they became a cop, if not before, they were indoctrinated. You don't fight a war without propaganda. And the propaganda that has attended the drug war in this country has in some cases been quite silly, and many ads, for example, discredited and pulled from TV stations and so forth. But it's been remarkably successful. It has convinced us that drugs is a menace. Drugs have ruined an awful lot of lives. Let me be real clear about that. I'm not condoning, I'm not encouraging, I am certainly not advocating drug use, much less abuse. I'm just saying we need to get a whole hell of a lot smarter about where to place our drug issue. And the criminal justice system, in my judgment, is not the place for it. The public health system is. Somebody who is addicted, for example, to heroin, is in need of medical treatment, not bars. And for that matter, clean needles and supervised injection sites and other kinds of interim steps that we can undertake to reduce death and disease and crime and violence. But a lot of cops do get it, and they're just afraid. If I say it out loud, I'll never go to Dick's. I'll never be a homicide detective. If I say it out loud, whether it's spoken or not, I won't get promoted to sergeant or captain or chief. So fear, I think, sits at the top of the list. And that's a product of how effective the propaganda mechanism has been that's accompanied the drug war. And we're now seeing a real crack in that defense of current drug policy. Well over 50% of Americans support marijuana legalization. I am not talking about medical marijuana. The numbers there are far greater. We have reached that magic point at which we could say the majority of Americans want to see that substance legalized, which will allow us to regulate it and control it. It will give us more control over what our kids are taking, and it really will. So the numbers are with us. The more we are able to provide political cover to people who are frightened, whether it's the governor of the state who, having received a letter from the U.S. attorney, decides to gut reasonably decent legislation. And on one level, I don't fault her at all. She was told explicitly, if you sign this bill, you are exposing state employees to arrest. We all know that the federal government trumps local governments when it comes to drug law. That's something we clearly need to change. But fear.
Okay. This card says DOJ says the SPD is broken. Do you agree?
I think the institution is broken. So by definition, I'm saying that San Diego and Seattle and New York and every other police department in this country is broken. The system that we have elected or inherited to provide police services is broken. That barrel does need to be replaced. It's a paramilitary, bureaucratic, organizational arrangement, which means that it's top-down in its orientation, in policy-making and decision-making. It means that it's focused on internal bureaucratic requirements. Are your shoes shined? Is your hair cut? I used to get dinged often for my hair. Is your car free of jack-in-the-box trash and sunflower seeds? Are you being reasonably respectful to your sergeant? Where in that process are we asking, are you working as a partner with the community you've been hired to serve to identify and analyze and solve problems? How are you treating your fellow officers? How are you treating your community? And we have provision for that in our performance evaluation systems, but we really don't have sufficient provision for it structurally. If we were, in fact, to break down the paramilitary bureaucratic organizational arrangement and build a system that is designed around the mission, around the purpose, the reason for existence of a police department of free, democratic, ostensibly multicultural and pluralistic society. And the mechanism was built really at the turn of the last century. The last century. It's been added on to, it's been modified in tweaking form over the years, but not a whole lot. It's the system that was built to deal with thoroughly corrupt police officers of the teens and the 20s and the 30s in this country, in cities all across the country. It was built to deal with police corruption. Nobody would argue that we ought not to be attentive to corruption issues. But we can build a much better system, and one that would encourage officers to come forward in the face of corruption if we were to treat them as mature and respected adults, even as we insist that they act as mature and respected adults.
I'm going to read part of this question as a follow-up to what you're saying. What will it take, or what steps are needed to change that racist, sexist military culture? What role can the community play in making these things happen? This woman comments, as a woman of color, I fear for my sons and grandsons.
This question affects me at the deepest levels. In San Diego, I was at a huge community meeting that is so typical of huge community meetings that follow what the community calls an outrage and what the chief calls a tragic accident, a dead kid. And I will never forget a middle-aged African-American woman who stood up and said, Chief, I want you to hear this. I was the operations chief at the time and the top-ranking member of the executive team at this meeting. And her voice was trembling, and she said, my greatest fear is not that my sons, now turning 12 and 14, will get jumped into a gang. My biggest fear, one that keeps me awake night after night after night, is that they're going to have an encounter with one of your people and they're not going to come home. And then I'm going to get a call at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning from the morgue. I get to Seattle. I'm at a community meeting. This was after a police shooting. This was an unarmed black man who was shot and killed by one of my police officers on Martin Luther King Day. It's like, who wrote this script? I looked at every angle of that case and I retained the officer. I did not punish the officer, but I disciplined him. He went through exhaustive retraining. I was convinced, based on expert opinion that I brought in, that what had happened is he was chasing this domestic violence suspect who had beaten the hell out of his common-law wife across a rubble-strewn backyard that used to contain another building but now had foundation and low-lying fences and so forth, shortly after midnight, which made it Martin Luther King Day, with his gun out. And the suspect tripped. It was raining. It was blowing in horizontally. And the suspect tripped, and the officer reached for him, and his gun discharged. He said it immediately. Oh, my God. He knew immediately that he had, with a semi-automatic weapon, you learn very quickly that you don't have your finger in the trigger guard unless you intend to pull that trigger. You're supposed to index the finger. He didn't have, as a rookie police officer who was getting high marks from community, I read his file exhaustively, spent a lot of time, had a personal conversation with the guy as well. He had not indexed his finger. It was in the trigger guard. I took a lot of heat for that. It's the same decision I would make today. I went out and spoke to half a dozen pastors in the African American community. I went to a lot of community meetings, and it was at one of those big meetings when yet another African American woman stood up and said, my biggest fear is that my son, who's becoming a teenager, is going to get shot and killed by a police officer. I have listened as recently as today in a community meeting to people who say, I have a 17-year-old son. I have taught him since he was this big. If you see a police officer, keep your mouth shut. Be polite, be courteous, keep your mouth shut. Don't get loud. Don't move suddenly. If you go into a store, be really careful. There's much conversation about a bag of Skittles today. If you're not familiar with that, we can talk about it some other time. But it's really, really important to understand those fears in the community. Police officers oftentimes will say, as they did in San Diego, we feel like we have a target on our backs. 11 San Diego police officers were shot and killed in an 11-year period. That's a terrible mortality rate for cops, and it affects them. Fear is like the worst motive when it comes to officer safety practices. Alertness, sensitivity to your environment, to the surroundings, so on and so forth. But fear causes people to do impulsive things. And anger is sometimes how fear gets expressed. But I suppose I could go on forever and ever. But when you get to the nub of it, when you're talking about the safety of your children and your fears of your own police department, that's time for us to have a really honest and sustained conversation about what we can do with police selection and training and so on and so forth.